Hi, ladies. Good afternoon. I hope you're all doing well. Sorry I cannot be there with you today in class, but I wanted to kind of start us off so we don't get too far behind in notes. And today we're going to be talking about life at the turn of the century for African Americans specifically. So, this unit that we're going to be starting this week covers a lot. So, if you kind of flip through your new note packet, you'll see we're going to cover Jim Crow and segregation. We're going to look at um, the progressive era, women's suffrage. So, there's kind of like a lot of bits and pieces that we're looking at. And we actually start off this unit in prior to actually the time period that we're going to be focusing on. And that's because obviously this is an extremely important topic, and we're going to be linking this first part of the civil rights movement to other things as we go out throughout the course. So um, we kind of, again, kind of go back a little bit further in history to probably things at least touched upon in your 8th grade American history class. So you learned a little bit about the Civil War and then Reconstruction, which is that period that happened after uh, the the Civil War. So just to kind of review that in a little bit of a way in terms of like what was happening in society. So when the Civil War occurred, of course, there was still slavery, and slavery has been a part of had been a part of this country since the beginning, since people colonized here. And at that point, there were some states in the North that had abolished slavery, but all of the Southern states still had it. It was one of the issues of why the Civil War happened. Um, so once the North, if you forgot, the North wins, thankfully, and so our country is now unified once again, and it doesn't just like go away. Of course, your journal today is asking you about what are some issues with race and discrimination today. And unfortunately, we don't get to talk about it together in class, but hopefully we will when I come back. Um, the things that happen today, the things that you are watching on the news or maybe even personally involved in or experiencing, this is stuff that unfortunately has been a part of our society since the beginning. And so we're going to look at the ways in which that has gotten better. And of course, those issues that we still have to address. So going back to our notes here, we're going to just kind of review probably some things hopefully you learned when you were in elementary and middle school. But this is sort of where we're at the turn of the century, specifically looking at where African Americans are in society. So once slavery ends, it doesn't mean that like everybody's like, yay, okay, we're going to all get along and this is going to be great. You have to remember that when there was the time of slavery, that African Americans were not even looked at as human beings, let alone American citizens. So you're going from one extreme, to the next. And so, especially in the South, where this has been a part of Southern life, forever, this is going to be a really fragile time for society. And unfortunately, there are going to be many ways in which there are other methods of oppression for African Americans. And so the first of that is segregation. Segregation means the definition is you're separating people by race. So we're going to see the separation between black and white in most, if not all, public places in the South. But in the North isn't free from discrimination. It's not like the South where we're all a bunch of racists and then the North was fine. Racism is all over both the North and the South. Now, Jim Crow laws, okay, we're going to talk about Jim Crow laws in a moment. You read a little bit about that over the weekend. That's a little bit different. Those are codes or statutes that are written into state law and can vary from state to state, but were definitely in all Southern states. There was segregation in some areas of the North, and of course, there were many instances of discrimination and racism throughout this time period. However, we don't see the Jim Crow laws being as prevalent in the northern states as we do the South. So we're going to be kind of picking on some of those southern states throughout this. But what this did, Jim Crow, was basically treating African Americans like second-class citizens. So after slavery ends, there are amendments to the Constitution, one that abolishes slavery, one that gives Black men the right to vote. And then also looking at the fact that now, after slavery, everyone is considered a citizen, but that's not the way that actually happened in real life. So you will watch a quick video, which you're going to actually watch it separately. That's what I just kind of skipped over. There is a great documentary that PBS did. It's probably like 15 years old, but it's called The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow. And it's a really long documentary. Unfortunately, it's like probably 6 hours or something. We're not able to watch the entire thing in class, but we're going to be watching some video clips from it. I think that it does a really good job in explaining not just like Jim Crow and segregation from that time period that we're studying in from before, but how this is intricate in every aspect of life for almost 80 years. And the people that you're going to see throughout these clips, some of the people that are talking, you'll notice at the bottom when they show their name, they may have passed away, in the last, 20, 25 years. But the fact that these people are speaking firsthand about what life was like because they grew up in the South. They grew up before the civil rights movement had accelerated in the 50s. And they know firsthand experience what that's like. This is not ancient history, okay? This is very modern, contemporary history. This is stuff that is still affecting us to this day. And again, we're going to connect all of that here in a little bit. But going back to Jim Crow, that first video clip that you're watching is kind of an introduction to what the documentary is about, but it specifically addresses what Jim Crow is and isn't. And so the name Jim Crow is just named after a 19th century minstrel show called Jump Jim Crow. He was not a person, or it is not a person. Okay. I think that's often confused of like, oh, these laws are named after someone, and it's actually not. It kind of gets these like nicknames. They're actually called black codes when you're looking at the laws that are written in some states. But back in the 1800s, there were like theater shows, the minstrel shows that were supposed to be like comedic and based on comedy. And unfortunately, there was one specifically called Jump Jim Crow. You saw kind of an interpretation of that in the video. And it was really just a stereotyping African Americans of that time. And so it was mocking. Okay, it was something to mock them. And this phrase, this idea, this name Jim Crow will come to personify what will be government sanctioned racial oppression and segregation in the United States. Before I started, I again, since I'm not with you today, I'm trying to do this as best as possible without actually being there. But I told yesterday's class when we started to talk about this is that this is probably, next to slavery, the worst thing that has ever happened in our country in terms of oppression and really violation of human rights and constitutional rights for Americans. It's very shameful. And sometimes, these things are hard to learn about and hard to talk about, but it's so important that we understand the past in order to understand the present. And even though you may come from another ethnicity, another race, you may not have experienced or will experience some of these things, just because it doesn't happen to you doesn't mean that it's not happening. And I think it's extremely important to understand the past with this type of topic to understand the present. And it's hard. We're going to have some, hard conversations throughout the course, especially when it comes to issues about racial justice and issues with racism in our country, because it is real and it is valid and it does happen and it still happens. Okay, so that was my little thing I forgot to say in the beginning. Going back to the notes, Jim Crow, these laws will appear a few years towards the end of Reconstruction. So we're talking probably about 10 years or so after the Civil War ends, 10 to 15 years. And so basically, these are ways, again, to separate the races, to try to preserve what people thought that American identity was. So it goes back to what we learned in the first unit about the acronym WASP, White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. Okay. It will all kind of tie back to that in any type of racism or discrimination issues. And when we talk about specifically Jim Crow and segregation, again, we are separating the races, black and white, in all public forums. Okay, so you're probably most familiar maybe with like segregation in schools, but this was everywhere. I mean, this was parks, this was eventually it'll be movie theaters. Unfortunately, this lasts for so long that we're going to see like transportation systems, for example, will start off being separation of races on the railroads, but then eventually we'll get to buses and things like that because this will last through the 1950s. They're not allowed to use the same drinking fountains, okay, or public restrooms, or sitting in the same sections of the theater. So I mentioned movie theaters, but before that could be like live productions. And it's important to always remember that even though these races are separate, their facilities are not equal. Okay. The facilities for blacks are always inferior to those for whites. And in the pictures and some of the things you're going to be looking at today, you'll definitely see the difference. Okay. So it's not equal in any way. This is just a slide to show you some of the laws from specific states. So Jim Crow laws were prevalent throughout the southern states, but each state could vary in like what they said about certain types of laws. And you're going to see more of these in the activity that you're going to do today. But you can kind of, it's a little hard to read because the font is small, but like in North Carolina, it talks about free public school will be provided for children. White and black children will attend different schools, but there will be no prejudice for either race. Whichever race a school book is given to, it must only be used by that race. And that's another really important fact to remember about segregation in schools is that most often the white schools would receive more funding, would receive more materials like textbooks, and the black schools would not. And in North Carolina, for example, they weren't able to share any of those materials. And so definitely going to see a difference in the quality and the kind of education that those schools provided or didn't provide in some cases. One of the biggest setbacks for specifically black men, because again, women don't have the right to vote until 1920, but this will be about voting. And so, of course, part of the amendments that are added to the Constitution after the Civil War is that black men get the right to vote. And so, of course, society, especially in the South, and really in general, discrimination, racism, hatred, or dislike for other people that are different from you really all stems from ignorance, and also from a fear of the unknown, a fear of change, a fear of not knowing what's going to happen next. And so a lot of white Southerners feared that with black men voting, that maybe, African Americans would then gain political power. Maybe they would actually like run for office. And for them, that was very, very scary. So there were many ways in which they tried to oppress black men from voting. And this starts to happen in like the 1890s into this time period that we're studying. And so we're going to look at of three of the ways in which they tried to suppress the Black vote. And these three things are now all illegal, thankfully. But these three tactics were often used, unfortunately, for a long time. And again, in every state, it's going to vary. So you might not see all three of these in every state. And some of these things were like tried, but they felt like they weren't good at enough from keeping Black men from voting. So they would decide, okay, we're going to try this. It's important to note that all of these restrictions, the reason why the states were able to keep them as law for a long time is that it doesn't specifically call out a particular race. So this applies to all voters. Okay. But there are ways around. There's loopholes given to white people or white men. So the first one is poll tax. And poll tax is it's a fee. Okay. It's a fee that you have to pay before someone was permitted to vote. Well, of course, when we're looking at statistically Blacks versus whites, especially in the South at this time, it was really hard to find a job. So most African Americans were living in poverty, and they couldn't afford the $1 or $2 that it would be to vote. The way around this tax was to show that you owned property. Well, most of them did not own property, but white men did, so they could get around this tax. Literacy tests were another way to try to suppress the Black vote. Many, I should say, African Americans, especially in the South after slavery, were illiterate. Okay, they had no education. They had no formal education. They weren't attending school at that point. And so they probably lacked or maybe had very minimal knowledge of reading and writing. And these literacy tests, because I'm recording my screen, I don't think I can show you the attachment I have here, but it's basically an example of a literacy test that was given in Alabama. And these were actually a little bit later on than the time period that we're studying. And they were pretty ridiculous because it's not even proving that that you could read or write. These were actually like government questions. So unless you had formal education or you were involved in government, most likely you couldn't even answer these. And this restriction actually backfired on Southern whites because there were many, especially like poor farmers, that weren't literate and they were not able to vote. So there was no like loophole, I guess, around taking a literacy test as there was like a poll tax. So this was kind of a fail at that point of trying to do what they intended to do. But this restriction, grandfather clauses, will be the one that will really suppress the Black vote. And that's because a grandfather clause is basically saying you had to prove that your ancestor, so whether it could like your father, grandfather, or before that, had previously voted in an election. Well, if you were a Black man, you couldn't prove that because they didn't have the right to vote. Okay, they didn't have ancestors that had the right to vote. So obviously, it's very intentional that it was trying to protect white voting rights. Okay, because it's going to exempt all of those guys because they've had people in their family or men in their family that have voted before. And again, these laws were kept on the books because it wasn't considered unconstitutional at first because it wasn't singling out a group by name. So if it had said, only Black men had to pay a poll tax or only Black men had to take the literacy test, so that would be something a little bit different. But the way that they wrote the laws was kind of circumventing that. So that was something that was successful. And unfortunately, it stays like that for quite some time. Eventually, these will all be ruled unconstitutional, thankfully. But there are other ways that suppressed Blacks from voting, which, of course, is just violence, intimidation, physical threat. Like the day of the election, there would be people at the polls that would be intimidating and threatening, especially Black men from voting. So we'll see statistically, even though Black men technically have the right to vote, we're going to see very, very low voter turnout for many, many, many years. That brings us to this case of the Supreme Court's decision of a landmark case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And this is what's known as the separate but equal rule. The other video that you're going to be watching, if you haven't watched it yet, gives you a little bit of background on this. But this happens in 1896. This is a huge setback for those that are trying to fight Jim Crow and these segregation laws. And basically, in this case, a man named Homer Plessy had sued the state of Louisiana for violation of his 14th Amendment right, which is equal protection under the law. And in Louisiana, it required separate seating between the races on railroads. And he was, I believe, accidentally seated in the white section because he was a light-skinned black man. So oftentimes he could pass for what they would call pass for white. And he actually spoke up and said, "No, I'm black." And so then they all kind of freaked out and they made him move. It's kind of similar in some ways to Rosa Parks on the bus in the 50s, but a little bit different. And so there was kind of this movement happening behind the scenes. And they talk a little bit about that in the video. And so they pushed this through to the Supreme Court, and the acronym SCOTUS, SCOTUS, stands for the Supreme Court of the United States. If you didn't know that, there's SCOTUS, there's POTUS, which is President of the United States, and there's FLOTUS, which is First Lady of the United States. But the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, so when the Supreme Court rules on something, these are why some of these are called landmark Supreme Court cases. That means that it's really has affected society in a big way. And unfortunately, this is one that, honestly, in my opinion, I think this is probably the most, well, obviously worst case, but definitely the one case that I think affects society the most throughout U.S. history until we get Brown versus Board of Education in the 50s that reverses this first case. So basically, the majority on the court said it's a 7-1 vote. So 7 justices agreed that the 14th Amendment does not guarantee social equality, only political and civil. As long as the facilities for blacks were equal to whites, that it was constitutional. And we know that it's not, because none of the facilities thereafter will ever be equal. So the separate but equal is pretty much a joke, because there's no way that there's any equality in segregation. But unfortunately, this happens in 1896. This will be a part of the law until the 1950s. So we're looking at 60 years of segregation. In the one justice who dissented, meaning that they voted against it or they voted rule it unconstitutional, he said, in respect to civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. So a little bit definitely ahead of his time on this case. There's huge historical impact. I can't emphasize that enough. Plessy versus Ferguson is the biggest setback to civil rights for African Americans ever. Had this not happened, maybe things would have progressed a little bit better, or a little bit faster. But it did not. So, and this was one of the many cases that was brought in front of the Supreme Court throughout this part of history and continuing into the 20th century. Basically, the other part of Plessy, the case of Plessy, it allows the states to control these laws. Okay, so it's basically the federal government saying, okay, state governments, you can have your Jim Crow laws, you can have your black codes, you can have your segregation, whatever. We're not going to interfere. We're not going to change that. And again, it does not happen until 1954. So we'll look at Brown versus Board of Education more in detail next semester, because we'll go throughout the course, kind of looking at certain aspects, but we'll have our Civil Rights Part 2 complete unit next semester. So Brown versus Board of Education, though, that is the case that will overturn Plessy in a way, because they rule that that segregation in public school is unconstitutional. And that kind of sets It's kind of a domino effect. So once that happens, it sets kind of like releases uh, the dominoes, so to speak, because we'll start to see more and more things being integrated based on Brown versus Board of Education, and it's difficult. We'll definitely look at the difficulties of that, but that was a good thing on the road there. I think we're going to stop there. So when you're finished with your notes, make sure you watch those videos, ladies. They're a couple minutes, maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes a piece, but that will kind of help you with maybe understanding some points, especially like this case, Plessy versus Ferguson. You are going to, if you are in class, the sub should give you a handout that says Jim Crow at the top, and there's a picture of the drinking fountain. So you're going to be looking, answering those questions, looking at that primary source, that picture. That's the first half, and then the second half, or the bottom half of the paper, it'll say like documents 1 through 10. You're going to be analyzing some primary sources, and those are on Classroom. So if you look at Classroom, I believe it's called Jim Crow documents, like primary source documents or something. So you're going to open up that, and it's going to show you a bunch of different examples of Jim Crow. So whether it's like written law, or it could be like other pictures, it could be signs and things like that. You have to categorize those. So you can refer back to the handout that you read for homework. And hang on to those worksheets, because I will collect those from you, but I'm not going to do that while the sub is there. So just hang on to those. Anyway, so you're going to categorize those. And again, that's on the handout if you need help with that, and then answer the questions at the bottom. Your homework is also going to be on Classroom. So even if you are an in-class student, you are going to be working through Classroom online, and you're going to upload that assignment for Friday. Those of you that are online, you're going to be doing the same activity as those that are in class, but both the worksheet and using the documents on there are both on Classroom for you. So in-class students, you have a paper copy. Virtual students, you have the handout online on Classroom. So tomorrow, I will be available during flex time. So you can hop on. I do have a couple students in a government class that are retaking a quiz during that time. So if I don't get to you right away, you can pop back later, or I think my quiz is set up to be at 10:30. So pop in before, or maybe after 10:45. If you have any questions about anything that you did today in class, or anything for the homework, or you can just write me an email. I will be checking my email as well. So have a great day, and I will see you guys soon. Thanks.